In 24 hours, Stalin lost more aircraft than any nation had ever lost in a single day of war. 3 weeks earlier, Joseph Stalin received a direct intelligence report from his most reliable spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, one of the greatest intelligence operatives in history, stating that Germany would launch a full invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Stalin read it. He wrote one word in the margin: disinformation. Now, at 3:05 a.m. on June 22, 1941, approximately 2,700 German aircraft are crossing the Soviet border in the largest single air operation in the history of warfare. The Soviet pilots on those illuminated airfields will have, in most cases, less than 4 minutes of warning before the bombs start falling. By the time this single day is over, the Soviet Air Force will have lost more aircraft than any nation had lost in any single day of combat in the entire history of aviation, in any war, ever. And that is only the beginning of what happens today. August 23, 1939, Moscow. To understand June 22, 1941, you must first understand August 23, 1939, the day that shocked the world. On that date, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. The two most ideologically opposed regimes on earth, one built on the doctrine of anti-communism, one built on the doctrine of anti-fascism, agreed not to attack each other and secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. It was a lie. Both sides knew it was a lie. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf in 1925 that Germany's destiny lay in the conquest of the Soviet East. He called it Lebensraum, living space, and he had never abandoned the idea. The pact was a tactical convenience. It bought Germany time to deal with Western Europe. The moment Britain was neutralized or contained, Germany would turn east. Britain was not neutralized, but Hitler turned east anyway. In December 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Directive 21, the operational order for Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Its objectives were staggering in their ambition. The German armed forces were to invade the Soviet Union, a country covering 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, destroy the Red Army in a single summer campaign, capture Moscow, Leningrad, and the industrial regions of Ukraine, and establish a defensive line running roughly from Arkhangelsk in the north to Astrakhan on the Caspian. This was to be accomplished before the onset of the Russian winter. Hitler and his generals estimated it would take 8 to 10 weeks. The Wehrmacht deployed for Barbarossa was the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history. 3 million German soldiers, approximately 600,000 vehicles, 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, 17 armored divisions and 13 motorized divisions, organized into 3 massive army groups, north, center, and south, each targeting a different axis of advance into Soviet territory. Alongside the Germans were their allies, Romania, Hungary, Finland, Slovakia, Italy, and Croatia, contributing approximately 900,000 additional soldiers for a combined invading force of nearly 4 million men. 4 million men against a country that did not know they were coming. This is the part of the story that historians still struggle to explain, because the intelligence warnings were not subtle, they were overwhelming. Between January and June 1941, Soviet intelligence received more than 80 separate warnings from spies inside Germany, from foreign governments, from Britain's Churchill, who passed on ultra-decrypts, from the Soviet military's own border reconnaissance, that Germany was preparing a massive invasion. The warnings were consistent. The troop movements along the border were visible from Soviet soil. The German reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory were being tracked. Stalin dismissed every single one. His reasoning, as it can be reconstructed, was a combination of ideological conviction and strategic miscalculation. He believed Hitler would not be stupid enough to open a two-front war while Britain was still undefeated. He believed the warnings were British disinformation designed to drag the Soviet Union into the conflict. He believed the German troop buildup was a bluff, an attempt to extract economic concessions. And he was so certain of these beliefs that he made it dangerous for his own generals to tell him otherwise. The culture of terror he had created, the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, in which he had executed approximately 35,000 Soviet military officers, including 3 of his 5 marshals, meant that no one in the Red Army command structure was willing to deliver news that contradicted Stalin's assessment. The last warning came at 12:30 a.m. on June 22, 1941, from a German sergeant who defected across the Soviet lines and told Soviet border guards that the invasion would begin at 4 a.m. The information was passed up the chain. It reached the appropriate commanders. Orders to raise the alert status were finally transmitted to forward units. Most of them never arrived in time. June 22, 1941, 3:05 a.m., simultaneously across 2,900 kilometers of border. The attack did not begin at 4 a.m. as the German sergeant had reported. The Luftwaffe crossed the border at 3:05 a.m., 55 minutes before the ground forces moved. The objective was to destroy Soviet air power on the ground before it could get airborne, before Soviet pilots could even reach their cockpits. The German plan was methodical and had been rehearsed for months. 66 Soviet airfields had been pre-selected as primary targets. The Luftwaffe's first wave, more than 500 aircraft, hit all 66 simultaneously. The results were catastrophic. If you are still watching, please comment where you are watching from and don't forget to subscribe or ask any question bordering you. 3:15 a.m., Brest-Litovsk region, Belarus. At the airfields around Brest-Litovsk, Soviet aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip in the pre-dawn darkness, exactly as regulations required for inspection. The bombs hit them in rows. Within 12 minutes of the first strike, 74 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground at this single location. The surviving mechanics and ground crew ran onto the airfield and tried to push burning aircraft away from those that were still intact. Several were killed doing it. 3:18 a.m., Kobrin Airfield, western Belarus. At Kobrin, the attack caught an entire regiment of I-16 fighters on the ground. The regiment commander scrambled to the airfield in his car and found his aircraft burning. He ordered his pilots to take off in whatever was still flyable. Several aircraft got airborne. Most were shot down within minutes by waiting German fighters. The regiment ceased to exist as a fighting unit before sunrise. 3:32 a.m., Pruzan Airfield, Belarus. Here, one Soviet pilot managed to get his aircraft airborne during the attack and actually intercepted a German bomber. He had no ammunition. It had not been loaded because the airfield was at peacetime readiness. He rammed a German Heinkel H-110 bomber with his own aircraft. Both planes went down. He became one of the first Soviet heroes of the Great Patriotic War. His name was Dmitry Kokorev. He was 22 years old. He survived the ramming, bailed out, and continued fighting for another year before being killed in action. 3:30 a.m., across the entire western border. The scale of the destruction in the first 90 minutes was beyond anything the Soviet command structure could process. Reports were flooding into military district headquarters, but the communications lines were already being cut. German special forces, Brandenburger units disguised in Soviet uniforms, had infiltrated the border region days earlier, and had spent the last several hours cutting telephone lines, destroying radio relay stations, and capturing key bridges. Soviet commanders were trying to reach their units on lines that no longer worked, relaying orders through runners on roads that were already under attack. The command structure was not just under pressure, it was dissolving.
June 22, 1941, 4 a.m., the entire western border. German panzer columns crossing Soviet border bridges, infantry advancing through early morning mist, artillery barrages lighting up the horizon. At 4 a.m., the German artillery opened fire along the entire 2,900-kilometer front simultaneously. The barrage was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, something beyond comprehension. Not a bombardment, a wall of fire and sound stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Then the tanks came. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2, 820 tanks, crossed the Bug River on pre-positioned bridges and drove deep into Soviet-held Poland. To the north, Panzer Group 3 under Hermann Hoth crossed the Niemen River. To the south, Panzer Group 1 under Ewald von Kleist punched into Ukraine. The Soviet units in the path of these armored columns had received no coherent orders. Some fought, some ran, some simply stood and watched the German tanks roll past, unable to process what was happening. In several locations, Soviet commanders refused to believe the attack was real and ordered their men not to fire, fearing it was a provocation that Stalin had not authorized a response to. The speed of the German advance was staggering. By noon on June 22nd, just 8 hours after the ground assault began, German spearheads had penetrated between 50 and 80 kilometers into Soviet territory on multiple axes. Entire Soviet divisions had been surrounded and cut off before they had time to withdraw. June 22nd, 1941, 3:30 a.m. The Kremlin, Moscow. At 3:30 a.m., Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff Georgy Zhukov telephoned Stalin at his dacha outside Moscow to report that the invasion had begun. German troops were crossing the border. Soviet airfields were under attack. Soviet positions were being overrun. Stalin was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Come to the Kremlin." When the senior Soviet military leadership gathered in the Kremlin in the pre-dawn hours of June 22, 1941, they found a Stalin who was, by the accounts of multiple witnesses, visibly shaken in a way none of them had ever seen before. He sat, he smoked, he asked questions, and then did not seem to hear the answers. Zhukov later wrote that Stalin seemed crushed, that the man who had terrorized an entire nation, who had sent millions to the gulags, who had executed his own military commanders for imagined disloyalty, seemed in those first hours unable to accept that he had been wrong, that Hitler had done exactly what Stalin had been told Hitler would do, that the intelligence reports he had dismissed as lies had been accurate. At 7:15 a.m., 4 hours after the invasion began, Stalin's headquarters finally issued Directive No. 2 to the Soviet military. The directive ordered Soviet forces to use all forces and means to attack the enemy and to destroy the German forces that had crossed the border. It also contained one extraordinary line. Soviet aircraft were not to bomb German territory beyond a depth of 150 kilometers without specific authorization. The Soviet command was, still 4 hours into the largest invasion in human history, afraid of provoking Germany. The directive was militarily incoherent in any case. The units it was ordering to counterattack had, in many cases, already been destroyed, surrounded, or cut off from communication. Soviet armored units that attempted to execute the counterattack orders drove their tanks forward without air cover, without fuel resupply arrangements, and frequently without accurate maps, straight into German anti-tank gun positions that had been prepared specifically to receive exactly this kind of uncoordinated charge. The counterattacks failed everywhere.
and in failing, they cost the Soviet Union thousands of additional tanks and tens of thousands of additional soldiers that it could not afford to lose. June 22, 1941, midday, Stalin's dacha. At approximately midday on June 22nd, 9 hours into the invasion, Stalin left the Kremlin and returned to his dacha. He did not make a public statement. He did not address the Soviet people. He did not issue new directives. He simply disappeared. For the next 11 days until July 3rd, Stalin made no public address to the Soviet Union. The country was under the most catastrophic military attack in its history, and its leader had, in the estimation of multiple historians, suffered something close to a complete psychological breakdown. Zhukov and other senior commanders continued trying to manage the military situation without clear direction from the top. Molotov, the foreign minister, went on Soviet radio at noon on June 22nd to announce that Germany had attacked, in a speech that ended with the words that would become the rallying cry of the entire war. "Our cause is just. The enemy will be beaten. Victory will be ours." He was sounding like he was trying to convince himself. June 22nd, 1941, sunset, the entire Soviet western border. As the sun set on June 22, 1941, the scale of what had happened in a single day began to become visible, though even Soviet high command would not understand the full scope of the disaster for several days because so much of the communication infrastructure had been destroyed. The Soviet Air Force had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft destroyed on the ground and another 300 to 400 shot down in aerial combat. In total, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 aircraft in a single day. This figure exceeded the total air losses of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined during the entire fall of France in 1940. It was the single greatest loss of air power in any day of any war in the history of aviation. The Luftwaffe lost 35 aircraft. On the ground, the picture was equally devastating. In the Western Special Military District alone, the sector covering Belarus, 4 Soviet armies had been struck simultaneously and were in various states of encirclement or disintegration. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Front, was attempting to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened to his forces. He could not. Too many of his communication lines were cut. Too many of his units had ceased to report. In the first week of Barbarossa, not just day 1, but the 7 days that followed, the German army took approximately 300,000 Soviet prisoners in the Bialystok-Minsk encirclement alone. By the end of summer 1941, the total number of Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans would reach approximately 3.3 million. 3.3 million men. Of those 3.3 million prisoners captured in 1941, approximately 2 million of them would be dead by February 1942. Not killed in combat, dead in German prison camps from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate neglect. The German military's treatment of Soviet prisoners was governed by Hitler's ideological designation of the war in the East as a war of annihilation, of Vernichtungskrieg, in which the normal rules of warfare did not apply. This is where military history and human rights history collide. What began on June 22, 1941, was not merely a military campaign. It was the opening of the most lethal theater of conflict in the history of human civilization, a front on which over the next 4 years, approximately 27 million Soviet citizens would die. 27 million. Nearly half of all deaths in the entire Second World War on a single front between 2 countries. The German plan for Barbarossa was not irrational. It was based on a careful, if ultimately flawed, analysis of Soviet capabilities and vulnerabilities. The Red Army in 1941 was genuinely weakened. The Great Purge had destroyed the professional officer corps. Equipment was often obsolete. Doctrine was rigid and poorly adapted to the kind of fast-moving armored warfare the Germans had perfected in France. the political commissar system, placing Communist Party officials alongside military commanders with authority to override military decisions, created paralysis at critical moments. And in the first 3 months of Barbarossa, the German plan came terrifyingly close to success. By early October 1941, German forces had captured or destroyed an estimated 15,000 Soviet tanks and 100,000 Soviet artillery pieces. They had captured Kiev, the largest city in Ukraine, in September in an encirclement that netted 665,000 Soviet prisoners. They were within 15 kilometers of Moscow in December.
Yes, clear. Loud and clear.
The Soviet Union lost 1,800 aircraft day one. By 1944, Soviet factories, many relocated to the Urals beyond German bombing range in the desperate months of 1941, were producing more than 40,000 aircraft per year. June 22, 1941 is called in Russia the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. It is not called the beginning of the Second World War, even though it was the same conflict. It is given a separate name because for the Soviet Union, what began that day was categorically different from anything that had come before or would come after. It was the most destructive single event in the history of their nation, and their nation survived it. General Georgy Zhukov, who spent that first terrible day trying to make sense of reports from a front that had ceased to have coherent form, would go on to become the most decorated military commander in Soviet history. He would lead the defense of Moscow in December 1941. He would plan the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in November 1942. He would command the final assault on Berlin in April 1945. Stalin, after his 11-day disappearance, returned. He hardened. He reorganized. He proved capable, in the extremity of national survival, of a flexibility and pragmatism that his pre-war behavior had not suggested. He restored several of the officers he had previously purged. He allowed his generals to make tactical decisions without political interference, sometimes, not always, and not consistently, but enough. General Dmitry Pavlov, who commanded the Western Front on June 22nd and failed to hold it, was arrested, tried for cowardice and dereliction of duty, and shot. He was not a coward. He was a competent officer who had been given an impossible situation by a leader who had refused to believe the situation was coming. He died anyway. This was the Soviet Union's way of processing catastrophe. Find someone to blame, shoot them, continue. It was brutal, it was unjust, and it worked, in the sense that the Soviet Union continued fighting when any rational analysis of the losses of June 22, 1941 would have suggested surrender. Tell me in the comments, do you think Stalin knew? Was it denial, or was it something calculated, something he believed was strategically smart and simply turned out to be catastrophically wrong? I read every comment, and this one is going to be a real debate. Subscribe if you are not already, because the next video on this channel goes inside a battle that makes day one of Barbarossa look like the beginning of the story, which of course it was. Tell me in the comments, do you think Stalin knew? Was it denial, or was it something calculated, something he believed was strategically smart and simply turned out to be catastrophically wrong? I read every comment, and this one is going to be a real debate. Subscribe if you are not already, because the next video on this channel goes inside a battle that makes day one of Barbarossa look like the beginning of the story, which of course it was.